We spoke with Alison Lloyd from the MRC Laboratory for Molecular and Cell Biology from University College of London. We spoke with Alison after she gave a really wonderful talk about her work with regeneration in nerve cells and Schwann cell differentiation. Some of the work she presented is from her paper that was published in Cell in 2015. This paper is actually very approachable and is a very interesting read regardless of your background. She talks about engaging her students in creativity, and we talk about publication and some other really interesting topics that I think you'll enjoy.
My name's Alison Lloyd, and I'm a professor of cell biology at the MRC Laboratory for Molecular Cell Biology at University College London.
Good. And how did you get started working at this particular lab? Is this like the first lab that you started, or is this...
Yes.
Yeah.
So I started my lab there, and I've been there ever since.
Uh-huh.
It's hard to know whether that's a good plan or a bad plan to stay in the same place, because you do gain a lot from moving. But UCL is a huge university, and everything is going on there. So it's a very attractive place to work.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's why I've stayed.
Mm-hmm. And how did you get started there?
I'd finished I was on my second postdoc, and I always wanted to run my own group, and there were things that I wanted to do. And I applied for a fellowship. And I think in those days, the CRUK that was running these fellowship schemes, there weren't very many. I think there was one for the whole country.
Wow.
And I didn't get it, but I asked this laboratory to host me, and I think I started with just a project grant, so it was a very small amount of money. And then I put in for a fellowship further 6 months later, and I got it the second time round. Mm-hmm. So I've never had a real position. It's half the people who work in my institute have always been on grants from outside. Mm-hmm. So I've never been core funded as a group leader. Mm-hmm. So if I think for about the first, 10 years at least, my salary was paid by my own fellowships, and that paid for my research. Then UCL took me on, took over my salary, so now I'm HEFC funded, but still all of my research money comes from competitive grant systems. And in my institution it's about 50-50, about 50% have a sort of a core funded support, and the rest of us have grant support. And there's disadvantages and advantages of both, really.
What do you think have been the kind of biggest challenges having that type of direction instead of maybe going straight into a university-funded faculty position?
Well, there's the best things or the most difficult things. So the best things is that you're in a solely research environment. So you do a little teaching, and there is the entire academic environment around you, but you're in a research institute, so it's focused on research, and that means that you can efficiently perform your research. And I think that's very important when you're first starting your group, especially, that you can really just focus on getting things going. So I think in that way it's brilliant. The problems with being funded in that way and it's the same for everybody, it's the instability.
Yeah.
But I don't think that there is true stability in any research area, and I don't think there should be. Many more people want to do research than really can be supported. So it has to be competitive, and I fully understand that, and I think that it's correct that it should be very competitive. But I think when you're on this sort of money it's very difficult to find soft money. So by soft money, I mean if you want to extend a project by 1 year, or you've got a postdoc who you want to keep on a little bit longer. And this is really important for your science. It's also very hard to get a laboratory manager funding or that type of thing, because you put in for a grant and you're occupying, this person's going to do this. So who's going to run my lab? Who's going to help me manage my lab? It's very hard to get money for those types of things. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the problem that hasn't really been addressed very well. And that makes it difficult for me, but I would say more for the people who work for me, in that it gives them much more instability because there aren't those types of resources.
Yeah, we have been talking a lot about that. I mean, also us being in the same situation where we are like postdocs every 2 years, 3 years, we have to find something different. And this lack of stability. I understand what you say, that should be competitive, and I see that not only in science in general, this is how it works.
I wonder if there's a way to still have competitive, encouraging kind of environments for research, but also maintaining a type of stability that doesn't make you feel like you might have to close up shop next year if you don't get the grant funding, or that you are constantly kind of in this hand-to-mouth sort of
I mean, I'm not in a hand-to-mouth because my salary is secure now. Mm-hmm. So I don't have that. And once you get sort of tenured, you have that. So it's more about whether I would have to move more into teaching.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that's not a terrible option. No, it might not be what I want the most, but it's not a disaster. Mm-hmm. It's at this point, it's much more difficult for the people in my group.
Yeah.
Because although, of course, I want my group to be really successful, I'm not going to be on the streets. And if I'm not getting funding, I probably don't deserve it.
Right.
So, but there are sometimes, there's people in your groups who are excellent and who should be funded and need another year. And it's really hard. It puts them in a very difficult position. And I think that institutions should really plan for that much better, because it's a good all-round. It's the benefit of everybody. The trouble is, I think when people have had those funds, everyone's just used them in a lazy way, in that people have just gone and everybody sort of said, oh, I can get a bit of extra money. You could also make that quite competitive, so it really was the people who you felt or had shown that this would make a real difference, and then there should be this, more bridging funds. And it's up to the institution. Probably there are ways of doing it, but there's not enough thought and time put into that. At the early stages of your career as a group leader, I don't know what you can do about it, because how can you make it more secure? You're given 6 years. If you don't publish anything or you don't go anywhere, you deserve security. You deserve more money to do the same thing. That's a difficult question. I mean, everybody wants it and thinks they deserve it, but if you've been given a chance, and now I think that most fellowships and starting things are about 6 years, and if you can't show in that time that you can do something, then
I think the kind of idea of deservance, it's like, well, everybody works hard, of course.
It's not about
we all
working
think,
hard.
But
it's not about working hard. I mean, part of it is, but just because you work hard and do a good job, you wouldn't argue that in any other creative field. Oh, this person works really hard. Yeah. If they're not really talented, they're not going to be supported. And it is a creative. It's a creative industry, is the way I see it. You have to try and do things that are imaginative and different, and that's, I think, what should be rewarded.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that especially what you say about it being a creative field, I think oftentimes scientists get painted as these very, linear thinking, very reductive, which we can be, I think, a lot of times, but you do have to think of new things all the time, and what are new or interesting or creative ways of solving a problem.
Yes.
And you say that you mostly work with in research, but I figure you've got postdocs and grad students in your lab. How do you foster that creative enthusiasm in them? How do you teach? How do you go about I don't know if you can teach it, but how do you encourage your students to be creative problem solvers?
I make a lot of sarcastic comments. Like, that train has left the station. I try and always make them think about the question right from the word go. I think that especially people when they come into the lab, they just want to get started.
Yeah.
And they come in and they just want to do things, and you say, and they come and they say, well, where is this going? What question?
Mm-hmm.
And then people also come to me and say things like, oh, somebody's shown that this is like this. Let's see if it's like this in our system. And I sort of say, yes, let's do some real derivative research. So I try and foster two things. I think one is popular, one is not so popular. So the first, I try to always say, let's always go for questions where the answer that we have initially is, I have no idea. Because if those are the sorts of questions you start with, the answer is going to be important because we don't really... So it's less like to be incremental science.
Mm-hmm.
The second is that I really do try and force people to be independent.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that that's as popular as you might imagine.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes insisting that people do things themselves, it's not that popular.
I know
because it's hard to think.
Yeah.
My advisor said that when she remembers her first graduate students or first technicians, when she first started out on her own, the hardest thing was to sit on her hands and let them do it themselves. And I oftentimes am reminded of that when I'm overseeing undergrads or master's students as pipette faster, do this faster. And it's like, I could do it so much faster. And I was like, I also have 10 to 15 years of experience on top of them. And if they don't get the experience themselves, then how do they learn to think for themselves, or at least become confident in their own technique?
I mean, I was very fortunate in my mentors, the people that I did my PhD with. Alan Hall and Chris Marshall were really talented, imaginative scientists who, and I think it was, especially I felt in Britain, right from a very young age, you were encouraged to be independent. So I think it tends to be the way UK has always been, in that the first question they ask is, how independent are they? And you ask right from the undergraduate, were they working independently? And you're really encouraged. It's always been, I think, the philosophy, which I don't know so much about in America, but certainly in many continental countries, it's much less, it's more hierarchical. So I think that I've always been very fortunate with mentors, and then I had Martin Maff when I moved to the Institute to start my group, and he really fostered a very creative type of environment, and I liked that.
I think if you, as you said, if you create this creative environment, like going from the question, then I think you kind of force the people to think about their own experiments or where they want to go. You cultivate this attitude.
Yeah, I think that's actually something Maria and I talk a lot about in our own lab meetings, is asking the graduate students, I think particularly, why did you do this experiment? What made you think of this? What's the point of this?
And I think a lot, what I also find, and maybe it's good or it's bad, it's this idea that people want to finish their experiments even though it's really clear that they're not going anywhere. So I do think that you have to have completeness is sometimes not the best way to go. Sometimes you can't finish everything. Sometimes you also have to sort of say, okay, well, I haven't done this experiment 3 times, but it's a disaster. And it's just not showing me anything. I'm leaving it. So a lot of people they're sort of so stuck in this mode of, I have to do. You think, well, why are you wasting all of this time, money, and energy for something that really is not going anywhere? And I think also that's another thing to sort of, sometimes you have to just cut and run. You have to know when something is not giving you anything. Other times it's the opposite. Sometimes you really have to persevere because there's something really important that you want to, and you do think So it's a mixture of those two things. I think knowing when to really persevere, because it is so important, and you understand why you're not getting there.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's other times where people can just get really stuck. They get stuck in the mundane, or they get stuck in something that's just not tractable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was actually, as you were talking, I was thinking, this sounds like you got to know when to cut and run, which is what you said. I think that sometimes failing a couple of times and trying to think about why your experiment didn't work, or maybe your approach wasn't right, but being able to think about that critically helps you get to the point where in the future you can say, yeah, this isn't going to be worth the time or the effort, or I didn't set this up right. I oftentimes think, seeing a couple of students saying, oh, I forgot my negative control or my positive control, but I'll do my experiment anyway. And it's always like, but why?
Exactly.
Will you be able to make any type of decisions or interpretations on this? I
had a lab meeting just this week when, in my view, I saw the videos and the person had quantified them all. And I just couldn't understand why they would do that, because there's nothing obvious going on. And I wouldn't be trusting of anything that wasn't obvious in a way.
Mm-hmm.
If you have to do some, particularly when you're looking at behaviour, if you have to sort of then do some weird quantifications and then ask whether you're seeing anything, I really don't trust that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Statistics can make things happen.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You were talking about some of the mentors that you had as you progressed to this point in your career, and there's a scheme here of giving early career scientists like postdocs and senior graduate students the opportunity to have mentors, I think within and also without of their fields, right?
Without usually. I mean, you can choose, but for example, I chose somebody without outside of my field, but
but there's a real push to kind of give new researchers or early career researchers kind of more mentor support. And I have to say, I agree, of course, that mentors are really important to have. But I sometimes question how you go about choosing, how do you go about choosing a mentor, or are you chosen by a mentor, or do you luck out?
Well, I've been given mentors as part of these processes, and none of those have been mentors.
Mm-hmm.
My mentors have all grown. Well, the first two were my joint PhD supervisors, so that was obvious. And the other was somebody who just happened to be in the institute who I just had an affinity with. And I would go to them because I liked them and respected them and thought they were funny. The ones I've been given, it never worked. It was more, you go and see them. And I've been asked many times to be people's mentor, and I've recently said no to all of them, because I'm asked a lot, because I'm female and there aren't enough females, and because I'm already mentoring too many people. Now I already have to do a lot of mentoring for all of the young group leaders within the building, plus all the people in my lab, and I just felt I just can't take on any more when it's going to be not necessarily useful. If it was, if I get on with a student, say, or a postdoc in the building, we just develop a natural rapport. I will read their grants. I will chat with them because it's developed naturally. They've come to me about something, and it's one thing, but it's not sort of an official meeting where yet again I have to read somebody's thing and what they're proposing and all this sort of stuff. So I have mixed feelings about it, but it's probably not in principle, but just in reality, I can't take on any more. I feel I can't take on any more because I have to do, as you get more senior, you spend so much of your time reviewing what other people are doing that you just have enough of it.
Yeah, that was actually a question that I wanted to ask about kind of running your own lab, but all of the other responsibilities, and not necessarily work-life balance, because I don't really like the idea of work-life balance. I personally don't think it exists. But what about time management? How have you come to kind of successfully, or as best you can, manage all of the responsibilities outside of running your own, that is just running your own research group? Because obviously there's, editing and reviewing and mentoring and all of these things.
And admin stuff.
Admin stuff, yeah. Yeah, just managerial types of skills.
That's sort of almost a question about mental health, isn't it?
Well, I'm actually, the where it comes for me is almost purely time management. Is how, I know for myself kind of what has worked and what hasn't in terms of managing my own time.
Yeah.
And I know that when I was going from being a technician, there was, basically managing my day-to-day research, and that was my time management. And then when you go to graduate school, you have to add on not only are you doing research, but you may also be doing teaching. You're also taking coursework, so you have a different set of things that you need to manage. You might be training undergrad interns in your lab or whatever. And then when you become a postdoc, you kind of add more to that. And so I know the things that worked kind of for me in every stage. But when I start thinking about, okay, once you get a faculty position, now there's even more things that
I
you
think the
have
most
to do.
important thing that you can learn is to say no.
Mm-hmm.
I think recognizing what you should be doing and what you shouldn't be doing. Again, this is another thing that comes down on women a lot, because they tend to be given a lot of rules, a lot of jobs that are not that important. So you should say no to all of those. So only try and say yes to things that are important. I mean, you do have to say yes to things that ensure that science continues. So you never say no to doing a PhD viva, for example.
Mm-hmm.
You never say no to sitting on a grant committee unless you've got too many, because otherwise the system would break down.
Mm-hmm.
So there's certain things that you never say no to, but there's lots of other things that you have to start saying no to, otherwise you will have no time and then you won't function. The other thing, I think you have to accept that there are times when it's all a bit out of control, in that there's just everything has come to a head at the same time, that you've got 5 deadlines, and then you just have to accept that you're just working all the time for that period. But then you just have to ensure that at a time after that, you make sure you have a break.
Mm-hmm.
You have to recognise it's a real marathon.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's the way I think about it. You have to think of your career like a marathon, in that sometimes you do have to work so hard because a paper, a grant, a particular deadline's coming up, all these sorts of things. All you're doing is working. But that's usually, you have to make sure that that's only for a short period, and then you have to make sure that the work that you're doing is actually meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
So I do say no to quite a lot of things. I say yes to a lot of things, but I have learned to say no to things that I don't think are important enough.
Mm-hmm.
And do you think, well, obviously, I guess it's important to learn that at every stage, because I think a lot of times I try to think at my level, I should try to get as much experience as possible. So I should do peer review, any paper that I get asked to review, I should review it. If I get asked to sit on a committee, I should sit on that committee. If my boss says, oh, we have some undergrads or a master's student who wants to mentor them or oversee them, I should say yes to that, because this is all kind of building my skill set. But just like at anything else, at any other time, that means that that's time away from writing my own papers or doing my own experiments.
Yes, things are important, but the bottom line is your output.
Yeah.
And everyone has to remember that. So I can sit on grant committees, I can do all these things, but the bottom line when I put in for my funding is that is a minor consideration. What people want to see is what you've done. So you have to remember what the bottom line is in that way, and really remember that and ensure that you're moving forward. Because all of these other things are sort of
supplementary, maybe.
They're supplementary and they dissipate your energy to an extent.
They're pretty time consuming.
They're
too.
really time consuming.
Yeah.
And I think it's a major complaint of my colleagues that you spend your whole time practicing for other people, because now everybody goes for a job interview, everybody's up for their grant interview things, everyone wants you to read their grant, that you can't say no to things like that because someone's grant is so important. So you can't say no, but you just spend so much time doing that. But it doesn't help you at all. So you do certain things because they're important, but to do things that really aren't, when they're not going to help you, it might make you a better citizen in a way, but you won't be a citizen.
Yeah. Well, I guess like you say, if a colleague asks you to review their grant and they don't get it, they may not be your colleague anymore. But if they do get it, then maybe the next time your grant comes around, they would be happy to help you out too. It is kind of maintenance of your community.
I mean, I don't think you think about it quite like that. I just think that if somebody asks you, it's just one of the, you have some rules in science, I don't know, unwritten rules, and one of them is that if somebody asks for your help, you give it.
Yeah.
It's not because you expect it back, and a lot of times if postdocs are giving you their grants, you don't expect anything back.
Yeah.
But if somebody asks for your help, you do give it.
Yeah, it's a community. It's important to support that. And I think this is another thing that Maria and I talk a lot about is, science as a community and as a community that's supposed to share information with each other. And we spoke with Rory Duncan 2 weeks ago. And he's in Edinburgh at Hariot-Watt University. And he was talking about, the culture of hiding your science away in secret until you feel at some point it is ready to share.
This is a biologist.
In biology. Versus he works with a lot of engineers and mathematicians who are very quick to kind of just send their stuff out right away and get other people using it so that you can get feedback on how your program is working or how your model is working. But the biologists tend to kind of hide things from one another until they're ready to go. And he had questions, I think, about how healthy that was, but also how conducive it was to promoting our science and moving our science forward. And I think that it's a hard line to ride between collaboration and competition.
But it's also a hard line to ride between your reputation, I suppose, in a way. Your reputation is so important in science, and you don't want to share things with the community until you're sure about your findings. So I think that's another important drive. It's not so much secretive. It's that when you're messing around in the mud, as it feels like sometimes, trying to work out what's happening, you have an idea, but you also recognise that you could be completely wrong. And is it going to help the community sharing stuff which is half done? I'm not convinced that it is. There's already enough noise out there.
Sure.
That when people are usually ready to share, there's a few people who don't so much. Probably because they've been scooped at some point. I don't know, or it's different culture. But mainly I think it's because people don't want to give people wrong information. And there's already enough of them out there. So I would rather, a lot of people I've heard some recent suggestions that you should be putting everything online, your whole lab, as you're doing it. And I just thought that was the most ridiculous suggestion I've ever heard. Because as you produce stuff every day, trying to make sense of it and realising all of these types of things, you're just going to be giving misleading, I think, information. I think, if you're the Sanger Center and you're sequencing stuff, sure, you can put that out there straight away because it's just information that doesn't need to be interpreted, presumably, if it's just sequence. But when you're doing experiments, and there was somebody else recently who was saying that you have to, trying to enforce that people published all their negative experiments as well. And I also thought that was a ridiculous idea as well, because negative experiments are negative for so many different reasons. And in order to prove that they're negative, to show that they're negative, a lot of times it's just not tractable. It's sort of a negative experiment. I understand with clinical trials, of course, that's really important to publish. But now it's sort of trying to go further, that everybody should put everything they're doing, all their negative results, but they should publish their negative results because that's going to help the community. I'm not convinced about that.
Yeah, I think that it's a good point to say, there's a difference, or there's a potential difference between negative experiments and negative results that are important for people to know. We oftentimes joke about how, we wish that there was a journal that posts, that printed negative results because it would have like the highest impact factor that we could all get into, But yeah, I hadn't really thought about the difference between the, having negative experiments or negative controls or something that helped you kind of figure out what you were trying to do, which is, like you said, it's kind of just rummaging around trying to figure out where all the parts go together.
And you don't see anything, and so what does that mean? It could mean you're not. It's so many different reasons why. And
like a negative result, like we used to think that this is how it happened, but that's actually not how it happens because we couldn't get it to work, or this actually doesn't occur in nature, or something like those kinds of negative results might be actually very informative.
But they are publishable.
But they're publishable, exactly.
Yeah.
And because they're meaningful, people put the effort in. It's when that they're not. You do an experiment, it doesn't show anything. You're not going to spend all your time to try and work it out, or to get it in publishable form. Oh, let's do this many times and look at all these different caveats to show nothing.
Yeah.
It might be internally informative, but not necessarily important for publication, as you said.
I mean, I think that all of these systems and biology does get more and more complex. I think you do need a lot more openness in some areas, like clinical trials. A lot of those were kept secret, and I think that was very problematic. But there's so much noise in science as there is. There's so much that's just chucked out into various online journals, which hasn't been done to a very high standard or peer reviewed to a very high standard. How does that help anyone? I don't think it's just noise. So I would rather people put less out and just publish stuff that they were really sure about.
Yeah.
I think that meetings are really important, small meetings, because then people do discuss amongst themselves the complexities and the subtleties, but how you would share that globally and how it would be relevant to other than these 10 other people on the planet. I'm not that sure about.
If we were to kind of publish less but perhaps more comprehensive work, how does that fit into the current ways that our kind of activity is measured for our job progression?
I had the same question.
Yeah, I think it depends who you listen to. There are certain countries, again, where they just expect you to have loads of papers, even if they're very incremental. But I suppose I'm more used to the UK system, and they expect people to have published, but if they've published one paper from each position, they're more interested in what they've done and what they're interested in. I don't think there's so much counting that goes on here at all.
Not counting for how many papers, but definitely, I mean, this is my perception that there is a lot of weight on the impact factor where you publish, and I know that it's very hard for postdocs or for PhD students to publish in Nature or in Cell or on the big journals.
Yes.
Usually it takes more time than these 3 years or whatever to go for this big paper. So there it goes, this balance. Do I need to have more papers to show that I was productive, even though it might not be like a Nature paper, but still I was productive during these 3 years?
No, I don't think that will help you. I think that people want to see that you've done something original and something that's a little bit of a step change.
Okay.
Being productive and to just churn out something, I don't think people are so interested in. What is the case probably is that in certain fields, to do something in 3 years is very difficult, especially if you're in mouse or these types of model. I don't know with plants.
With plants, even, I mean, it depends on the plant, of course. I mean, I think of people who study trees, for example. They might publish once every 10 years. Thankfully, we have pretty fast growing plants.
We are okay.
Grow stuff up in a couple of months, but I mean, if you use a lot of transgenics, so do we, and I mean, it can take you a year easily to, develop a good solid line.
Well, from what I've seen, the postdocs and students who are going on to do good things are people who haven't just done their 3 years and gone. They've been able to stay longer to get a nice story. And that those are the people who have done well, and those are the people who seem to have the right understanding of what's important. It's not just about having a paper, it's having discovered something. So I think if you just keep that in mind, because if you discovered something, it's not that you're aiming for. If you ask an interesting question, you can't guarantee that the result will go in Nature. But if the answer to your question would not put your paper in a high-profile journal, then you're not asking the right questions, in my view. What you can't be sure about is that you won't find something that's not a particularly original answer, but that should still be a good piece of work. So I think I'm coming to, everyone keeps talking about impact as if it's like it's an unfair thing, but I think if you're asking original questions and you've found ways to address them, by definition, your work will publish in a higher journal. So again, the people who are trying to ask original questions, ask an original question, then it will. But if you start off with an idea, I just need to be efficient, and you're doing this sort of, when you ask the question, if you sort of say, if I discover this, it will revolutionise what? What will it change our understanding of? If it's not that much, well then, what's the point?
Yeah.
I know it's very different in non-academic science. So in translational research, it's completely different, because then you're often working within very narrow sort of windows to make something incrementally better. And that's very, very important. But for blue sky discovery research, it all comes back to, are you asking an interesting enough question? So that if I answer that question, should it be in a high impact journal? If that's your starting point, that will be your end point. So that's the way I tend to look on that. And I think usually the people who are concerned about impact is because they don't have that attitude in the first place.
I like this.
No, it's a good. It is. Well, I think it's comforting and also overwhelming to me. I mean, I remember the department that I was in graduate school was hiring a new faculty member my last year, and I think they interviewed 7 candidates, and they all had CVs like as long as my dissertation. I felt, at the time, I felt like they had pages and pages and pages of publications, and I think at the time I didn't really think to say like, oh, how many of them are first author versus, how long have they been in their postdoc, blah, blah, blah. But to me, they kind of seemed not that much older than me. They had these amazing CVs, and I thought, I'll never be able to compete with people like that. Maybe that's not really realistic in the end, but I think that it is it is sometimes discouraging to feel like I'm doing the things that I think that I'm supposed to be doing, and maybe like the projects that you choose, well, at least the projects that I choose do tend to be kind of ground up. I like to build my own tools, and I like to work a whole story. So I tend to feel like I have it takes me a little longer to get one paper out, but I can't kind of get a paper out every single year. But, every 2 years, every 3 years, maybe I can have a really nice big
I don't know anyone
story.
who publishes a paper every year.
Yeah, I don't know. I think
Unless it's something
or
with
reviews or something.
No, yeah.
But I think that it's somewhat overwhelming to think like, you ask the kinds of questions that I guess in your mind seem like they're the best questions to be asking, but sometimes in comparison to someone who's a little farther along, but you think, oh, in 3 years, am I gonna have a similar type of CV? Is this the type of person that I can compete for jobs against? And sometimes I always think, well, no, I don't know if I could compete with them. But maybe in the end, it comes down to not just evaluating how long someone's publication list is, but all of the other kind of components and aspects that they bring along.
From having sat on a lot of search committees, you never look at the length of the CV, ever. It's just not your consideration. What you look for, and I think this is what people don't get, and I think in many ways, I'm not saying CV doesn't count, you have to have a good track record, of course, but people are looking for very different things. So whether if you're looking for people who you think who have potential and who look like they're going to be creative and or fit in with your institute. So if you're doing stuff like grant reviews where it's blind, it's very different because you don't care about how they fit in because you don't know them.
Yeah.
So there you're just looking for somebody. They have to have had a good track record, but they have to be because you want to have proof that they have produced. Because there's loads of clever people actually who are full of good ideas, but have actually never managed to complete anything. So that's what your CV is often saying, is giving proof that you are this and that you can produce at each stage of your career. But I think most people will look to see that you've published something from each job that you've had, and then they're looking to see what you want to do. What are you proposing to do?
Proposal.
That's the major thing.
Yeah.
And then what a lot of things people don't get. So when we've done looking for people to be group leaders at our place, we'll have all of these CVs. Half of them will have brilliant track records and even be asking to do brilliant things, but we just feel that they wouldn't really fit in the institute, in that because we're quite a small institute, we want people who are going to be able to develop links. And so you're looking for somebody who overlaps to an certain extent with some of the other groups. And you look at somebody else and you just think, well, they're not going to interact with people here very much, and they're not going to benefit from this environment, from what they say they want to do. And that's a very big consideration for lots of recruitment.
I think that speaks a lot to choosing where you decide to apply to. So, I always think, saying like, seeing the list of places that you apply to just to get a job these days, it's like people just apply to everything. It's like, I always think, well, I don't want to live in Kansas. No offense to Kansas, but I don't want to go there. But it's also thinking, is this not only a place where I'm going to get a lot out of it, but what kind of contributions do I make to this environment as well? So I think that those are good things to think about. I had one question that I thought about that I'll ask you. Yesterday, and I think the day before on Twitter, they had a list of one piece of science. They were asking scientists to say one thing that they wanted people to know about science in general.
One
science tweet.
Yeah.
And
Oh my
the
goodness.
things
This is the problem with Twitter.
the things that people tweeted out I thought were very interesting. So they just kind of interesting facts or kind of opinions on science. Some of them, of course, were a little, I think, accusatory, but there were others that I thought were really positive. And I was wondering about your work. which in your presentation you said that there's like lots of different applications, not just in understanding about neurobiology and how these different cells interact together, but also how this can be applied to cancer biology and different aspects of cell growth. I think that there's a lot there. So I was wondering if you had one thing that you wanted people to kind of know about the work that you do, or kind of your field in general. What is it that you would like people to understand?
That's a hard one.
I don't know how to answer that, but I can only answer it by telling you what fascinates me. And that's maybe slightly different to most people. But what I find the most interesting question is how we stay the same. So homeostasis. Which seems strange in that I study regeneration. But what I find miraculous is, from my understanding, this is not one line, by the way, but
no, that's
maybe
fine.
there is one line for it. So when you study development and you think about development and how you make an organism, and then you think you reach adulthood, and then you're aiming to stay the same until you die, and then the whole body is trying to stay the same. And I find that incredibly remarkable when you think about all the different cell types that don't divide, that exist your entire life. Mm-hmm. And it's not that they're finished. And I think because I study cell biogenesis, I didn't talk about that at all today, but I study cell size control, cell biogenesis. I wrote a big review in Cell a couple of years ago. And cells are incredibly active. They're making stuff, they're degrading stuff. But if you look at something like your muscle or something, you can't see anything going on. It just looks as if nothing is happening. But all this is happening, but things stay the same. So I suppose that's what I'm most interested in, and I think is most fascinating, how cells can stay the same. And that's why I'm so interested in cancer, because it's the loss of that homeostatic state.
Yeah.
And that's where regeneration is important, because it's returning to that homeostatic state. So that's the one thing that I think people need to think about much more, because people study change, whereas I think staying the same is much more interesting.
Yeah, or maintaining sameness.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, homeostasis, that's exactly that definition.
Yeah.
So to my mind, that's something that and not enough studies gone into, but it's fundamental.
Yeah, I think that's
again, it's reverse creative thinking. I think coming from here. Yeah.
Excellent. I think that's a great place to
stop
to end.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Hope we enjoyed our conversation with Alison Lloyd. As always, you can follow Maria at m_Papanatsu on Twitter, and you can follow me, Emily Larson, at ER Larson _PhD.